A millionaire desperately screams, "Help, my son drowned in the lake," when he sees the child disappear into the deep waters. Suddenly, a little beggar girl appears running and dives in to save the boy. After applying first aid and bringing him back to consciousness, what happens next leaves the father completely shocked. When the boy finally wakes up and looks at the beggar girl, his first words make the millionaire's world crumble. What he reveals about this child changes everything. He believed he knew. The summer sun painted the sky a crystalline blue as Edward Sterling adjusted the rear-view mirror of his black BMW, glancing at his 8-year-old son in the back seat. Gabriel was playing silently with a toy car, his brown eyes reflecting the same intensity his father wielded in business, but with a sweetness Edward rarely allowed himself to feel. "We're here, champ," Edward announced, parking near Clearwater Lake Park. His voice had a strained casualness, as if showing affection, were a skill he had to practice. At 42, he had built a financial empire on calculated coldness and relentless determination. Expressing emotion had always been his greatest challenge. Gabriel jumped out of the car with the typical energy of childhood, yet his movements held a subtle caution, as if he were constantly testing his father's mood. "Dad, can I go to the lake first?" he asked, pointing to the crystal-clear water that mirrored the white clouds like perfect glass. Edward hesitated. This picnic was a desperate attempt at reconnection after months of distance caused by endless business trips. His wife, Marianne, was in Paris again, citing social engagements, leaving him alone with the responsibility of being a father, a role that terrified him more than any shareholders' meeting. "Sure, but stay where I can see you," he replied, grabbing the picnic basket. The park was nearly empty on this Tuesday afternoon, with only a few distant families and the gentle sound of birds filling the air. The breeze rustled the surrounding trees, creating dancing shadows on the verdant lawn. As he spread the red and white, checkered blanket on the grass, Edward watched Gabriel cautiously approach the lake's edge. The boy had always shown a particular fascination with water, something that unsettled Edward for reasons he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the vague memory of recurring nightmares that had haunted him for years, always involving water and an inexplicable sense of loss. "Gabriel, don't get too close to the edge," he called out, his voice echoing with an anxiety that surprised even himself. The lake, though seemingly tranquil, had deep sections near the rocks that lined its shore. Boulders, covered in a nearly invisible layer of moss, became treacherous when wet. The boy waved, but his attention was completely captivated by the golden reflections of the sun on the water's surface. Edward felt an inexplicable tightness in his chest, a premonition he tried to dismiss as mere paranoia. For the past few months, ever since turning 40, fragmented memories had been surfacing in his dreams, confusing images of hospitals, a baby's cry, and an overwhelming guilt he couldn't place. "Dad, look how the water shines," Gabriel exclaimed, crouching near the rocks to touch the surface with his fingers. His laugh echoed through the park, a pure sound that made Edward smile involuntarily. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel something other than the constant tension he carried on his shoulders. Marianne always criticized him for being emotionally distant, but Edward didn't know how to be any different. He had grown up in a family where showing vulnerability was synonymous with weakness, a lesson solidified during the years he spent building his business empire. Every decision was calculated, every move planned. But here, watching Gabriel interact with nature so spontaneously, Edward began to question if he wasn't missing something fundamental. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the fresh scent of water and the perfume of the wildflowers that dotted the park. Edward took a deep breath, trying to absorb the moment of peace. He couldn't have imagined that in a few moments this seemingly perfect afternoon would become the day that would change their lives forever, forcing him to confront secrets he kept buried in the depths of his consciousness. Destiny, at times, chooses the most serene moments to reveal its most devastating cards. Edward's scream tore through the park with an intensity that sent birds scattering in panic. In a split second, Gabriel had slipped on the wet rocks and disappeared beneath the lake's crystalline surface. The water, which moments before had serenely reflected the blue sky, now rippled in concentric circles, marking the spot where the boy had submerged. "Help! My son!" Edward ran desperately toward the shore, his Italian suit soaking through as he waded into the icy water. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he tried to locate Gabriel in the murky depths near the rocks. The lake, so peaceful from the surface, revealed itself to be treacherous, with undercurrents that thwarted any rescue attempt. Time seemed to stand still as Edward dove repeatedly, his lungs burning, his vision blurred by water and despair. Each second without finding his son intensified his panic. Confused images flashed through his mind, memories of recurring nightmares where water and loss mingled in an inexplicable anguish. "Someone, help me!" His cry echoed through the near-empty park, unanswered among the trees. The few distant families couldn't hear his desperate pleas. Edward felt helplessness corrode his soul as he continued to dive blindly, his strength rapidly draining. It was then that a small figure emerged, running from the nearby trees. A girl of about 8 years old, with torn, dirty clothes and matted hair framing a thin but determined face. Her brown eyes shone with a surprising intensity as she quickly assessed the situation. Without a moment's hesitation, the girl dove into the frigid lake with a technique that defied her apparent fragility. Edward, exhausted and panicked, watched in disbelief as she vanished beneath the water with precise, confident movements. How could a street kid swim with such skill? Seconds that felt like an eternity passed until the girl resurfaced, dragging Gabriel's unconscious body. She pulled him to the shore with a strength that was staggering for her size, her thin arms trembling with effort. Edward scrambled to help her, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. "He's not breathing," the girl said with a disturbing calm, immediately positioning Gabriel on his side and pressing on his back with practiced movements. Edward watched, stunned, as she applied first-aid techniques with a knowledge that transcended her apparent age. Where could a homeless kid have learned such specific medical procedures? Water gushed from Gabriel's mouth as the girl continued. The process, alternating between compressions and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Edward felt utterly useless, his expertise in commanding corporate empires irrelevant in this life-or-death situation. All his wealth and power couldn't save his own son. "Come on, breathe," the girl whispered, her small hands continuing their work with unwavering determination. Silent tears streamed down her grimy face, revealing a compassion that starkly contrasted with her neglected appearance. Finally, Gabriel coughed violently, expelling more water and gasping for air. His eyes fluttered open, still clouded with confusion and trauma. Edward knelt beside his son, tears of relief mingling with the lake water dripping from his hair. But then something extraordinary happened. Gabriel, still weak and disoriented, looked directly at the girl with a recognition that defied all logical explanation. His eyes filled with tears as he turned to his father, whispering words that would make Edward's world crumble completely. "Dad, my sister saved me." Edward felt the blood freeze in his veins. His son was obviously delirious from the trauma, yet there was something in the girl's gaze that deeply unsettled him, an inexplicable familiarity that made his stomach clench in panic. Edward stared at the girl, trying to process what he had just heard. His eyes scanned every detail of her face, the same brown eyes as Gabriel, the similar shape of her nose, the delicate line of her jaw that mirrored familiar features in a disturbing way. His heart raced as his rational mind fought against a possibility it refused to consider. "Gabriel, you're just confused from the accident," Edward said, his trembling voice betraying the uncertainty he tried to hide. "This girl is a stranger who helped you. You don't have a sister." The words came out mechanically, as if repeating the denial could make it true. The girl recoiled instinctively, her eyes revealing a deep fear that Edward recognized, the same cautious expression Gabriel sometimes showed. She looked ready to flee, like a wild animal assessing a threat, but Gabriel reached a hand toward her. "Don't go," Gabriel pleaded, still breathless. "I've always dreamed about you. You have the same smile I see in my dreams." His voice carried a childlike certainty that transcended logic, a conviction that made Edward feel the ground tremble beneath him. "What's your name?" Edward asked the girl, trying to keep his voice steady as he approached her cautiously. She watched him with suspicion, as if weighing whether he posed a danger. "Sophia," she answered in a low voice, almost a whisper, "but I don't have a last name. Never had a real family." Her words carried a sadness that sent an inexplicable pang through Edward's chest. There was something in the way she spoke, a familiar cadence that deeply unsettled him. Gabriel tried to sit up, still shaky, but his eyes remained fixed on Sophia. "Dad, she's just like me. Look, she has the same mark on her neck that I have." He pointed to a small, crescent-shaped birthmark Sophia had near her left ear, exactly identical to the one Gabriel had in the same spot. Edward felt the world spin. That birthmark was a quirk he had always considered unique to Gabriel. To see the same feature on a complete stranger defied his entire understanding of reality. His hands trembled as he struggled to find a rational explanation. "That's a coincidence," he muttered, more to himself than to the children, but his voice faltered at the end of the sentence, revealing his own doubt. Fragmented memories began to surface, vague recollections of Marianne returning from the hospital after Gabriel's birth, strangely evasive about the details of the delivery. Sophia noticed Edward's growing agitation and took a step back. "I should go. People get angry when I stick around too long." Her life on the streets had taught her to recognize signs of danger, and the tension emanating from the man before her was a clear warning. "No!" Gabriel cried, trying to stand too quickly and stumbling. "Sophia, you can't go! I felt you coming!" "To save me, I felt it right here." He pressed a hand to his chest. "Like when I dream about you, and I wake up happy, but I don't know why." Edward watched the interaction between the two children with growing unease. There was a connection between them that went beyond coincidence. The way they looked at each other, the way Gabriel instinctively trusted her, the way Sophia had appeared at the exact right moment. His business-trained mind, adept at spotting patterns and anomalies, began to form connections that terrified him. "Sophia," Edward said slowly, "where were you born? Do you remember anything about when you were a baby?" His question came out, more urgently than he intended, betraying a desperation for answers he both craved and feared. The girl studied him carefully before answering, as if weighing the risks of revealing personal information. The tension in the air was palpable, charged with possibilities none of them were prepared to face. Sophia hesitated for long seconds, her eyes shifting between Edward and Gabriel, as if calculating the risk of trusting these strangers. Finally, her voice emerged in a whisper laden with pain. "I was born at St. Francis Hospital. The woman who took care of me before she died, Rosa, always said there was some kind of mix-up when I was born, that I had a brother, but we were separated." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. St. Francis Hospital, the exact place where Gabriel had been born 8 years ago. The coincidence was impossible, yet the evidence was piling up like pieces of a puzzle he refused to accept. His legs trembled, and he leaned against a nearby tree for support. "Do you remember anything else?" he asked, his voice deeper than usual. The cold, calculating businessman was being replaced by a man desperate for answers that could destroy everything he believed in. "Rosa kept an old piece of paper with me, said it was important, but I never learned to read very well." Sophia reached into the pocket of her torn pants and pulled out a yellowed, stained piece of paper. She said, "I'd need it one day." Edward took the document with trembling hands. It was a partially legible birth certificate, stamped with the St. Francis Hospital seal. The date corresponded exactly to Gabriel's birth. The mother's name was smudged, but he could make out Marianne Stir. The rest was unreadable due to moisture and time. Gabriel, still weak but determined, limped closer. "Dad, I always felt like something was missing, like a part of me was far away." He looked at Sophia with an inexplicable tenderness. "When she saved me, I felt whole for the first time." The boy's words struck Edward like daggers, long repressed. Memories began to surface. Marianne returning from the hospital unusually tired and emotional, more so than expected for an uncomplicated birth. Her subsequent constant trips, always avoiding talk about the details of Gabriel's birth, the way she had changed afterward, becoming more distant and obsessed with social appearances. "Sophia, who was this Rosa? How did you end up with her?" Edward needed more information, even as he knew each answer brought him closer to a truth he dreaded facing. "She found me at the hospital when I was a baby. Said a nurse called her, told her there was a child who needed special care." Sophia wiped her nose on her torn sleeve. "Rosa was poor, but she took pity on me. She cared for me until she died last year. After that, I was on the streets." Edward closed his eyes, trying to process the information. A nurse who handed an abandoned baby to a stranger, no reputable hospital would do that officially. There was something very wrong with this story, something that suggested a deliberate scheme to make a child disappear. "Where did you learn first aid?" Edward asked, recalling the impressive competence Sophia had shown in saving Gabriel. "Rosa was a retired nurse. She taught me a lot about taking care of hurt people, said I had a natural talent for it." Sophia smiled shyly. "On the streets, I always helped the other kids when they got hurt. People say I have the hands of an angel." Gabriel reached for Sophia's hand, and she took it without hesitation. Edward watched the gesture and felt an almost visible electric connection between the two children. They complemented each other in a way that defied rational explanation, like two halves of the same being, finally reunited. The sun began to set, painting the lake in golden hues, but Edward barely noticed the beauty around him. His mind worked feverishly, analyzing every detail, every coincidence, every piece of evidence that pointed to a conclusion impossible to accept. Marianne had a lot of questions to answer, and he had a terrible feeling that the answers would change their lives forever. Edward carefully placed the yellowed certificate in the inner pocket of his jacket, as if protecting a crucial piece of evidence. His business mind began to formulate a plan, but his father's soul was torn between the need to uncover the truth and the fear of destroying the life he had built for Gabriel. "You both need to come with me," he said finally, surprising himself with his own decision. "Gabriel needs medical attention after the accident, and Sophia—" He hesitated, looking at the disheveled girl. "Sophia needs a safe place to stay while we figure this out." Sophia flinched. "I can't go to some rich person's house. They always call the cops or CPS. I'm fine on my own." Her experience had taught her that people with money rarely had good intentions toward abandoned children. "No one is going to hurt you," Gabriel said, with a conviction surprising for an 8-year-old. "My dad can be a little tough sometimes, but he's not a bad guy, and I'll protect you." He positioned himself between Sophia and her potential escape route, not as a threat, but as a protector. Edward watched his son's determination and felt a mixture of pride and terror. Gabriel was displaying an emotional maturity that he himself struggled to achieve. How could a child be so certain about feelings that defied logic? "Sophia, I promise you, you will be safe," Edward said, kneeling to be at her eye level. "I just need to understand what's happening here. These coincidences, they're not normal. You saved my son, and that means I owe you a debt." The girl studied Edward's face for a long moment. There was something familiar in those eyes, an intensity she recognized in herself when she looked in a mirror. Finally, she nodded, more out of exhaustion than complete trust. The drive to the Sterling mansion was tense and silent. Edward drove mechanically, watching the two children in the rearview mirror. They had sat together in the back seat, and Gabriel kept Sophia's hand securely in his, as if afraid she might disappear. The Sterling estate spanned 7 acres in the most exclusive suburb of Greenwich. As the automatic gates swung open, Sophia's eyes widened at the sheer scale of the house, a modern 2-story structure with enormous glass windows and meticulously landscaped gardens. "It's so big," she whispered, intimidated. Her past encounters with wealthy people had always ended in humiliation or rejection. The disparity between her world and this luxurious environment made her feel even more out of place. "A house is a house, no matter the size," Gabriel said simply. "What matters is who lives inside." His words revealed a wisdom that made Edward question if he was raising his son with the right values. Upon entering the house, Edward headed straight for his private study, where he kept important documents. He needed to review all the paperwork from Gabriel's birth, search for inconsistencies that might have gone unnoticed 8 years ago. "Maria," he called to the housekeeper, a woman in her 60s who had worked for the family for over a decade. "I need you to prepare the guest room and find some suitable clothes for—" He hesitated, unsure how to explain the situation. "For a special visitor." Maria observed Sophia with curiosity, but her professional experience kept her from asking questions. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Does the young lady need a bath and medical attention?" She had noticed the girl's scratches and neglected appearance. "Yes, please. And Maria, this needs to stay between us for now. Mrs. Sterling isn't to know about our visitor until I decide how to handle this." Edward knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he needed time to investigate before confronting his wife. That night, while Sophia took her first hot bath in months and Gabriel slept soundly after being checked by the family doctor, Edward remained awake in his study, surrounded by documents and photographs, trying to find clues to a past he may have never truly known. The next morning, Edward woke up in his leather armchair, surrounded by documents scattered across the mahogany desk. His all-night investigation had revealed minor inconsistencies in Gabriel's birth records, conflicting timestamps, signatures that looked slightly different, medical notes mentioning special procedures without clear specification. The sound of children's laughter echoed down the hall, a rare occurrence in the usually silent house. Edward walked to the living room and found a scene that made him stop in his tracks. Gabriel and Sophia were sitting on the floor, playing with building blocks, but it wasn't an ordinary game. They were building identical structures simultaneously, without speaking, as if sharing a single thought. "How do you know what the other is going to do?" Edward asked, both fascinated and disturbed. Gabriel looked up, smiling. "I don't know, Dad. I just feel what she's thinking. It's like she's a part of me that was lost." He took Sophia's hand naturally. "When she's sad, I feel a tightness right here." He pointed to his chest. Sophia nodded in agreement. It's the same for me. Last night, when Gabriel had a nightmare, I woke up scared in the next room. I knew he needed me. Her voice carried the simplicity of someone accepting the extraordinary as natural. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. Twins could have special connections, but this transcended any scientific explanation he knew. His rational mind was at war with evidence that challenged everything he believed about reality. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Dr. Henry Miller, the family's longtime physician and a personal friend. I need to talk to you about Gabriel's tests. His voice sounded worried. There's something strange I found during the routine blood work. What did you find? Edward asked, already dreading the answer. Gabriel's genetic markers. They show patterns that suggest he had a twin. It's subtle, but unmistakable to someone who knows what to look for. Edward, you and Marianne never mentioned twins. Was there a loss during the pregnancy? Edward almost dropped the phone. The scientific confirmation of his most terrifying suspicions hit him like a lightning bolt. Doctor, I need you to run a DNA test. I have a child here who might be related to Gabriel. I need absolute discretion. Of course, Edward. Bring her to the office this afternoon, and be prepared for any outcome. Situations like this rarely have simple explanations. After hanging up, Edward watched the two children continue their synchronized play. Sophia was now wearing clean clothes provided by Maria, revealing a delicate beauty that had been masked by the grime of the streets. The resemblance to Gabriel was even more striking, the same brown hair with golden highlights, the same line of the brow, the same shy smile. Dad, can I show Sophia my room? Gabriel asked. I want her to see my books. I bet she'll like the same stories I do. Edward nodded, watching them go up the stairs hand in hand. Minutes later, he heard Gabriel shouting excitedly, Dad, come see! Sophia can read the same words. I can, even though no one really taught her. Running up the stairs, Edward found Sophia fluently reading a children's book Gabriel had handed her. Her reading skills were surprisingly advanced for a street kid with limited education. How did you learn to read so well? Edward asked. I don't know, Sophia replied, confused. The words just make sense when I look at them. Rosa used to say, I was special, that I learned things faster than other kids. She flipped through the book with familiarity. It's like I already know these stories from somewhere. Edward realized he was facing evidence of a connection that transcended coincidence. These children shared something profound and inexplicable, and he was beginning to accept a truth that would change their lives forever. Dr. Miller's office was a familiar environment for Edward, but that afternoon it felt charged with an electric tension. The DNA test results were sealed in a white envelope on the desk, representing a point of no return. Gabriel and Sophia were waiting in the playroom, their laughter echoing down the hall like an ironic soundtrack to the most tense moment of Edward's life. Before you open this, Dr. Miller said gravely, I need to tell you something I discovered. During my inquiries, I called some colleagues at St. Francis Hospital and found irregularities in the records from 8 years ago. He paused, assessing Edward's emotional state. There was a hushed-up internal scandal involving irregular adoptions and the falsification of birth certificates. Edward felt the world spin. What are you saying? I'm saying someone with enough influence could have manipulated records to make it seem like only one child was born, when in fact there were twins. And Edward, the doctor hesitated. One of the nurses involved in the scheme was a Rosa Fernandez, the same Rosa who raised Sophia. The name hit Edward like a punch. Rosa wasn't just a kind retired nurse who took pity on an abandoned child. She was part of a deliberate scheme, possibly paid to make Sophia disappear from official records. But why? And by whom? With trembling hands, Edward opened the envelope. The words 99.7% probability of paternity seemed to pulse on the paper. Sophia was unequivocally his daughter, Gabriel's twin sister. 8 years of lies crumbled in seconds. "Henry, I need to know everything about this scheme. Who was involved? How did it work?" Edward tried to maintain his composure, but his voice betrayed his growing desperation. "From what I could gather discreetly, the scheme catered to wealthy families who didn't want the complications of twins or multiples. They paid significant amounts to have one of the children officially not exist. Rosa was paid to care for these rejected children, keeping them off the grid." Edward closed his eyes, trying to process the enormity of the betrayal. Marianne knew. She had always known she'd had twins and had deliberately chosen to keep only Gabriel. Sophia had been rejected like a defective product, condemned to a life of neglect and poverty. "There's more," Dr. Miller continued reluctantly. "Sophia has a rare congenital heart condition that requires constant monitoring. It's treatable with proper care, but it can be fatal if left unchecked. Rosa likely knew this and did what she could with her limited resources." The final revelation was like a knife to Edward's heart. His daughter hadn't just been abandoned. She had been condemned to live with a serious medical condition without the care his money could have provided from birth. At that moment, the office door opened, and Gabriel ran in, followed by Sophia. "Dad." Sophia fainted for a little bit in the playroom. She said she had a pain in her chest, but it's gone now. His concern was palpable, and Edward noted how he instinctively protected his sister. Dr. Miller immediately examined Sophia, confirming the signs of the heart condition. "She needs medication and immediate follow-up. With the right care, she'll live a normal life, but we can't ignore this any longer." Edward looked at his 2 children, a worried Gabriel holding the hand of a Sophia who was trying to hide her weakness so as not to worry her brother. 8 years of a lost life, of a denied connection, of a family shattered by greed and selfishness. "Doctor, I want Sophia to receive the best treatment available, starting immediately," Edward declared with ironclad determination. "And I want the names of everyone involved in this scheme, especially whoever authorized the specific case of my children." The moment of truth had arrived. Edward knew that confronting Marianne would destroy his marriage, but protecting his children had become his sole priority. The family he thought he knew was an illusion built on a devastating lie, and now he had to rebuild everything on the truth, no matter how painful. The 3 days that followed were a carefully orchestrated routine. Edward had started Sophia's medical treatment while trying to emotionally process the devastating revelations. During the day, he marveled at the natural connection between the twins, how Gabriel instinctively knew when Sophia needed to rest due to her heart condition, how she could calm him when nightmares of the lake accident troubled his sleep. That rainy Thursday, Edward was in his home office, reviewing medical reports on Sophia's treatment, when he heard the familiar sound of tires on the gravel driveway. His blood ran cold. Marianne was back from Paris, 3 days ahead of schedule. The sound of high heels echoed through the foyer, followed by his wife's melodic voice chatting animatedly with Maria about her trip. Edward took a deep breath, steeling himself for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. He still hadn't decided how to approach the situation, but he knew hiding Sophia any longer was impossible. "Edward, darling," Marianne called from downstairs. "I brought back the most wonderful gifts from Paris. Where is my little prince, Gabriel?" It was then that Edward heard Gabriel answer from upstairs. "Mom, you have to meet Sophia. She's amazing." The childlike innocence was about to detonate an emotional bomb that Edward wasn't prepared to control. Marianne's footsteps ceased abruptly. Edward could picture her expression of confusion as she processed the unfamiliar name. He hurried down the stairs, But it was too late to intervene. Marianne ascended the steps elegantly, her curiosity clearly piqued. "Sophia, who's Sophia, my love?" Her voice maintained the sweet tone she used with Gabriel, but Edward detected an undercurrent of tension. "She's my sister," Gabriel exclaimed with genuine joy. "She saved me at the lake. Dad said she can stay with us because she doesn't have a family." Edward reached the top of the stairs just as Marianne stepped into the guest room. What happened next would haunt him forever. Marianne saw Sophia sitting on the bed, reading a book to Gabriel, and she physically staggered back as if she had seen a ghost. Her face went deathly pale, draining all color from her carefully made-up cheeks. Her hands began to tremble violently as she leaned against the doorframe. "No! No! That's impossible," she whispered, her voice breaking. Sophia looked up innocently. "Hello, ma'am. You must be Gabriel's mom. He talks about you a lot." Her natural kindness was a stark contrast to the sheer panic in Marianne's eyes. "Edward!" Marianne screamed with an intensity that made both children jump. "Edward, get in here now!" Gabriel, confused by his mother's reaction, instinctively moved to stand between her and Sophia. "Mom, you're scaring her. Sophia is nice. She took care of me when I almost drowned." Marianne fixed her gaze on Sophia with an expression that mixed terror, guilt, and rage. Her hands continued to shake uncontrollably as she struggled to form words. She can't be here. This was never supposed to happen." Edward entered the room to find his wife on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Marianne's reaction confirmed all of his darkest suspicions. She didn't just know of Sophia, she recognized her instantly, which meant she remembered the daughter she had rejected 8 years ago perfectly. "Marianne, we need to talk," Edward said, in a controlled but firm voice. "Kids, go to Gabriel's room while your mother and I have an important conversation." "Dad, is Mom okay?" "She looks sick," Gabriel asked, genuinely concerned. Sophia held his hand, also alarmed by the woman's extreme reaction. "It's okay, champ. We just need to clear some things up. Go show Sophia your toys." Edward tried to maintain a reassuring tone, but internally he was bracing for the emotional storm about to be unleashed. Once the children had left, Marianne collapsed into an armchair in the room, burying her face in her hands. "How is she?" "Here. How did you find her? This is going to ruin everything we've built." Her words were a definitive confession that she knew exactly who Sophia was and what she had done. Edward closed the bedroom door carefully, creating a barrier between the coming conversation and the innocent children in the hall. Marianne remained, hunched in the armchair, her hands trembling as she tried to regain the composure that had always defined her. "You're going to explain to me exactly what happened 8 years ago," Edward said, his voice carrying an authority she had rarely heard from him. This was no longer the complacent, conflict-avoidant husband. This was a father protecting his children. Marianne lifted her face, revealing tears that smudged her carefully applied makeup. "Edward, you don't understand. It was for Gabriel and for our family. I couldn't raise 2 babies. It would have been too complicated, too chaotic." "Complicated?" Edward repeated, incredulous. "You're talking about our daughter as if she were an inconvenience. Marianne, we had twins, and you deliberately abandoned one of them." "I didn't abandon her," she protested, shooting to her feet. "I made sure she would be cared for. Rosa was a competent nurse. She promised she would take good care of the girl. I even paid her generously for it." Edward felt sick hearing the coldness with which she spoke of commodifying her own child. "You paid to make our daughter disappear because raising twins would be complicated for your social calendar. You don't know what it's like," Marianne shrieked, losing all composure. "I had just established myself in the city's most important social circles. Twins would have meant years of isolation, of doubled responsibilities. Gabriel was perfect, healthy, easy. Why complicate our lives with 2 children? And if Gabriel had been the one with health problems, would you have abandoned him too? Edward asked, his voice shaking with restrained fury. Marianne hesitated for a moment, and that hesitation was answer enough. Sophia had that heart problem. The doctors said she'd need special care, surgeries. It would have been too stressful. Gabrielle was easier to raise. She is our daughter, Marianne. Our daughter, Edward exploded, years of repressed emotion finally breaking free. You condemned an innocent child to a life of poverty on the streets without the medical care she desperately needed because it would be stressful for you. I thought Rosa would take proper care of her. Marianne defended herself weakly. I didn't know she would end up on the streets when Rosa died. You knew Rosa died? Edward cut in, realizing another layer of deceit. You kept in touch? You knew where Sophia was this whole time? Marianne looked down, defeated. I received occasional reports. I knew Rosa had passed and that the girl was struggling, but it was too late to go back. How would I explain it? How could I justify it? Edward stepped away from her as if her presence were toxic. You knew our daughter was living on the streets and you did nothing? While Gabriel grew up with every privilege our money could buy, Sophia fought to survive. I protected our family, Marianne cried desperately. I protected Gabriel from having to share attention. I protected our marriage from complications. You should be thanking me. Thanking you? Edward turned to her with a look of utter disgust. Marianne, Sophia nearly died multiple times because of the heart condition you knew she had. She learned first aid on the streets because she had to survive. She saved Gabriel because even after you abandoned her, she retained the capacity to love and protect. Real tears finally streamed down Marianne's face, but Edward doubted they were tears of remorse rather than self-pity. What do you want me to do now? It's been so long. I want you to take responsibility for what you did, Edward said firmly. I want you to look Sophia in the eye and ask for her forgiveness. I want you to help build the family that should have existed from the very beginning. And if I refuse? Marianne asked, a final grasp for control. Edward stared at her with absolute resolve. Then you made a choice between your children and your social life 8 years ago, and I am choosing between you and my children now. Sophia is my daughter just as much as Gabriel is, and nothing and no one will stop me from giving her the love and care she should have had from birth. The silence that followed was heavy with finality. They both knew there was no going back. This conversation had sealed the fate of their marriage and defined the priorities that would guide their family's future. The days following the confrontation turned the Sterling mansion into a silent, emotional battlefield. Marianne secluded herself in the master bedroom, emerging only for tense meals where she avoided all eye contact with Sophia. Gabriel, sensitive to the shift in the family dynamic, became even more protective of his newfound sister. Edward dedicated his mornings to Sophia's medical care, accompanying her to cardiology appointments and ensuring she took her prescribed medication. It was emotionally devastating to see how she accepted the medical attention with disproportionately intense gratitude, an 8-year-old child who had never had access to basic health care. Dr. Miller says my heart is going to get strong, like Gabriel's, Sophia commented during breakfast, holding her brother's hand as she took her morning pills. I never thought I could be fixed. Gabriel smiled proudly. I told you, Dad would take care of you. He takes care of everything that's important to him. His childlike words held a wisdom that made Edward wonder if he was being a good father, or if children were just naturally wiser than adults. Marianne chose that moment to come downstairs and join them for breakfast, something she hadn't done in days. Her appearance was as impeccable as ever, but Edward noticed the dark circles carefully concealed by makeup and the tension in her shoulders. "Gabriel, darling," she said with a forced cheerfulness, "how about we spend the day at the mall? Just the two of us, like we used to." Her attempt to reclaim normalcy was as obvious as her deliberate exclusion of Sophia. Gabriel looked from his mother to his sister, confused. "Can Sophia come too? She's never been to a real mall. It would be awesome to show her everything." The ensuing silence was thick with tension. Marianne visibly struggled between her desire to have Gabriel to herself and the impossibility of including Sophia without confronting her own guilt. "Sophia is still recovering. Maybe it's best if she rests," Marianne replied diplomatically. But her rejection was plain. "I feel fine," Sophia said quietly, but Edward saw the hurt in her eyes. Even at 8, she understood perfectly that she wasn't welcome. "Nobody is going anywhere without including the entire family," Edward declared firmly. "Sophia is part of this family now. Any family activity either includes her or it doesn't happen." Marianne stared at him with a mix of rage and desperation. "Edward, you can't force this. People need time to adjust." "Ooh. 8 years was enough time," he countered without hesitation. "Sophia will not be excluded from anything in this house again." Gabriel, sensing the rising tension, stood up and hugged Sophia protectively. "Mom, Sophia is my sister. She saved me. Why don't you like her?" Gabriel's direct, innocent question hit Marianne like a physical blow. She tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain to a child that she had rejected her own daughter out of convenience? "Sometimes adults make very big mistakes," Edward intervened, looking directly at Marianne, "and sometimes it takes them a very long time to admit those mistakes and try to fix them." Sophia, showing an impressive emotional maturity, pulled away from Gabriel's hug and timidly approached Marianne. "Mrs. Sterling, I don't want to cause trouble for your family. If it's easier, I can leave." Oh, the child's generous offer, her willingness to sacrifice her own happiness to avoid conflict, was the most revealing moment of the character each of them had developed. Gabriel immediately protested, clinging to his sister. Edward felt both proud and heartbroken at his daughter's kindness. Marianne looked at Sophia, truly looked at her for the first time. She saw her own brown eyes, the familiar line of her brow, the natural gentleness that was a trait of the Sterling family. For a moment, something in her carefully constructed expression shattered. You don't have to leave," Marianne whispered, the words coming out with difficulty. This is your home." It wasn't a full apology, but it was a first step. Edward recognized it as a small victory in a much larger emotional war yet to come. That afternoon, when an unexpected knock sounded at the door, none of them could have imagined that new challenges were about to test the fragile reconciliation that had just begun to form. The knock at the front door echoed again, more insistent this time. Edward frowned. They weren't expecting visitors, and the security team usually announced any arrivals. He walked to the foyer with Marianne following discreetly, both curious about the unannounced guest. Through the security monitor, Edward saw a middle-aged couple, dressed simply but neatly. The man wore a faded dress shirt, and the woman clutched an old purse to her chest. They both looked nervous, glancing around as if taking in the grandeur of the estate. "Can I help you?" Edward asked through the intercom, keeping the gate closed as a precaution. "Mr. Sterling," the woman's voice trembled. "We're Sophia's adoptive parents, Jim and Connie Peterson. We need to talk to you about the girl, urgently." Edward felt his blood run cold. Beside him, Marianne paled again, gripping the doorframe. Sophia's adoptive family, the ones who had supposedly taken her from Rosa and then abandoned her, were here, and Edward doubted their intentions were noble. "One moment," Edward replied, cutting the intercom. He turned to Marianne, who was visibly panicking. "Did you know they were coming?" "No, I never had direct contact with them. Rosa was the intermediary." Marianne shook her head frantically. "Edward, they can't take Sophia. Not now that..." "Now that what? Now that you've decided she can exist?" Edward couldn't hide the bitterness in his voice. "Go upstairs with the children. I'll handle this." Edward opened the gate and met the couple in the formal living room. Jim Peterson was a short, wiry man with calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. Connie was a tired-looking woman, but her eyes held a shrewdness that immediately put Edward on alert. "Mr. Sterling," Jim began, clearly uncomfortable in the luxurious surroundings, "we know Sophia is here. We have rights to her. We're the ones who raised the girl for years, until you abandoned her on the streets when she became an inconvenience," Edward replied coldly. "What rights do you think you have over a child you neglected?" Connie leaned forward, revealing her true nature. "Sir, we're not stupid. We know who you are. We know about your fortune. We also know you're not housing a street kid out of charity." Her voice took on a calculating tone. "A man like you doesn't take in a girl like that without a special reason." Edward kept his expression neutral, but internally he was bracing for what was to come. "And what reason would you imagine I have?" "It doesn't matter what your reasons are," Jim interjected, gaining courage from his wife's lead. "What matters is we can make this very complicated for you. The media, Child Protective Services, questions about how a homeless child ended up in your house." The blackmail was obvious, but Edward had navigated similar waters in the business world. "And what is it you want exactly?" $500,000, Connie stated bluntly. "In exchange, we disappear from Sophia's life forever. We'll sign. Any paper you want, relinquish any claim, the girl becomes your problem." Edward felt a wave of nausea at hearing Sophia treated like a commodity once again. "And if I refuse?" "Then we go to the press," Jim threatened, trying to sound more confident than he was. "Millionaire kidnaps street kid. Biological family searches. For missing daughter." You can imagine the headlines. It was then that a small, clear voice echoed from the staircase. "You're not my biological family." Sophia descended the steps slowly, followed by Gabriel, who held her hand protectively. Despite her medication, she seemed stronger every day with proper care. Connie stood up abruptly. "Sophia, honey, it's so good to see you're okay. We were so worried." Her attempt at maternal affection was pathetic and transparent. "You left me on the street after Rosa died," Sophia said with a calmness that was unnerving for her age. "You said I was too much of a burden. Why are you back now?" Gabriel positioned himself between Sophia and the couple, displaying impressive courage. "She's my sister, and she's staying here. You left when she needed you, so you can't come back. Now just because you want something." Edward watched his two children handle the situation with more dignity than the so-called responsible adults. "Sophia," he said gently, "do you want to go with these people?" "No," she answered without hesitation. "I want to stay with my real family, with Gabriel and with you, Dad." The word Dad struck Edward like a bolt of lightning. It was the first time Sophia had called him that, and the natural way. She said it revealed she had found her true place. "Then this conversation is over," Edward declared, standing up. "Sophia has made her choice, and I will respect it. If you attempt any form of blackmail or make any threats, you will be dealing with my lawyers." Connie tried one last gambit. "She's a minor. She can't decide for herself." "True," Edward smiled coldly. But I can. And as Sophia's biological father, with the documentation to prove it, I have full legal authority over her. You, on the other hand, never officially adopted her. You have no rights at all. The couple left, defeated, but Edward knew this might not be their last attempt at extortion. He knelt to his children's level, pulling them into a hug with an emotion he finally allowed himself to feel completely. In the week following the Petersons' visit, the tension in the house reached a critical point. Marianne had become increasingly withdrawn, spending hours on the phone in whispered conversations that ended abruptly whenever someone approached. Edward noticed her growing agitation, but was too focused on Sophia's care and the family's adjustment to investigate deeply. It was Gabriel who first sensed that something was profoundly wrong. On a Tuesday afternoon, while playing with Sophia in the garden, he suddenly stopped and clutched his chest, his face contorting in an expression of inexplicable pain. "Sophia!" he cried out, turning desperately to find his sister. But she was right there beside him, equally alarmed by the sudden anguish she also felt. "Gabriel, what's happening?" Sophia grabbed her brother's hand, and both felt the same sense of imminent danger they couldn't place. Their special connection was warning them that something terrible was about to happen. Edward, watching from his office window, ran into the garden when he saw the children's distress. "What is it? Are you in pain?" "Dad, something bad is going to happen," Gabriel said with absolute certainty. "I feel it in here. It's the same feeling I had at the lake, but different. Someone wants to hurt Sophia." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He had learned not to question the inexplicable connection between the twins. "Where do you feel the danger is coming from?" Sophia looked toward the house, her eyes fixing on the window of the master bedroom, where Marianne spent most of her time. "It's coming from inside the house," she whispered, a terrible understanding dawning in her childish eyes. At that moment, Edward heard the sound of cars approaching on the main driveway. Through the gates, he saw two black SUVs with tinted windows. They weren't official vehicles, but they had a menacing look that made his blood run cold. "Gabriel, take Sophia to the back room and lock the door," Edward ordered with urgency. "Don't come out until I come get you." The children ran inside the house as Edward headed for the main entrance. Marianne was rushing down the stairs, dressed for travel, carrying a small suitcase. Her expression was a mixture of desperate determination and overwhelming guilt. "Edward, I couldn't do it anymore," she said, avoiding his gaze. "This is destroying our life, our reputation, our marriage. I tried to accept it, but I can't live with this." "What did you do, Marianne?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer would be devastating. "I hired people to take Sophia away, to a place where she'll be well cared for, but far from us. Far from Gabriel." Her words tumbled out, as if saying them quickly would make the betrayal less terrible. Edward felt the world stand still. "You hired kidnappers to take our daughter?" "They're not kidnappers," Marianne protested. "They're professionals who handle complicated situations. Sophia will go to a good family in another state. She'll have medical care and education, just not here." "And Gabriel? Do you think he'll just accept losing his sister again?" Edward tried to remain calm, but his voice betrayed his rising fury. "Gabriel will get over it. Children are resilient. But if Sophia stays, our family will never be the same." Marianne finally met his eyes, her own revealing a coldness Edward had never seen before. From upstairs came Gabriel's desperate scream, "Dad, they're trying to get in through the window." Edward bolted up the stairs, followed reluctantly by Marianne. In the back room, he found Gabriel and Sophia barricaded behind the bed, holding each other and trembling. Through the window, he could see men in black attempting to force it open. "Marianne, call this off now!" Edward shouted, pulling out his phone. "I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've already paid them. They won't stop." Gabriel looked at his mother with an expression of absolute betrayal that struck her like a dagger. "Mum, how could you want to hurt Sophia? She's my sister. She saved me." In that moment, watching the terror in his children's eyes and the calculated coldness of his wife, Edward understood that the time had come to choose, definitively, between the past he had built on lies and the future he wanted to create, based on truth and unconditional love. Edward didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and dialed the private security firm he kept on retainer, while simultaneously triggering the house's alarm system. Sirens blared across the property as emergency lights flashed on, turning the mansion into an illuminated fortress. Active intrusion. Armed men attempting to abduct a child? Edward spoke quickly into the phone, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making crucial decisions under pressure. "I need police and my security team here immediately." Gabriel and Sophia remained huddled together, but Edward noticed something extraordinary. They weren't displaying the panic one would expect. Instead, they seemed to be communicating silently, strengthening each other through their special connection. "Dad," Gabriel said with surprising calm, "Sophia says they'll run when they hear the sirens. They're not brave people, just greedy." Edward looked at his daughter, who confirmed with a nod. The children's intuition was correct. He could already hear the sound of cars speeding away from the property. The kidnappers Marianne had hired had fled, realizing the operation had become too risky. Marianne collapsed into a chair, covering her face with her hands. "Edward, I just wanted our life back. The life we had before all this." "The life we had was built on a lie," Edward replied, kneeling between his children and hugging them protectively. "A lie you created when you abandoned our daughter. This is our real life, our complete family." Gabriel pulled away from his father's embrace and walked over to Marianne. With the emotional wisdom only children possess, he took her hand. "Mom, I still love you, but I can't let you hurt Sophia. She's a part of me." His son's words hit Marianne harder than anything else could have. She looked at Gabriel, then at Sophia, who watched her with a mixture of fear and compassion that was almost unbearable to witness. "I know you're scared," Sophia said to Marianne in a soft voice, displaying a generosity of spirit that transcended her age. "I was scared too when they left me alone, but being scared doesn't give you the right to hurt other people." In that moment, Marianne finally understood the magnitude of what she had done. She had not only abandoned her own daughter, but had tried to tear her away from Gabriel again, causing suffering to everyone she claimed to love. The police arrived minutes later, followed by the security team. Edward gave a detailed statement about the attempted abduction, providing all the information on the scheme Marianne had contracted. She would be investigated, but Edward made it clear his priority was protecting his children, not seeking revenge. "Marianne," Edward said when they were alone in the living room, the children finally sleeping safely in Gabriel's room, "you have a choice to make. You can get therapy, seek help to understand why you did this, and try to rebuild a relationship with our children, or you can keep running from responsibility." "And if I choose to try and fix this?" she asked, her voice cracking with the first genuine display of remorse. "Then we start with you asking Sophia for forgiveness, not just with words, but with actions. You have to prove you've changed, that you're willing to be the mother she always deserved." Edward paused, weighing his next words. "But our marriage is over, Marianne. You can be a mother to our children if you prove you're capable of it, but you can no longer be my wife." Marianne nodded through her tears, understanding that the consequences of her choices were irreversible. But for the first time in 8 years, there was a real possibility of redemption, not to save her marriage, but to save her soul and potentially build a true relationship with the daughter she had rejected. That night, as he watched Gabriel and Sophia sleep side by side, their hands still intertwined even in sleep, Edward finally felt a sense of peace. His family was complete, protected, and nothing and no one would ever tear them apart again. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful day at the lake, and Clearwater Lake Park had never looked so beautiful to Edward. The afternoon sun cast golden reflections on the crystal surface as he watched Gabriel and Sophia play in the shallows, their laughter echoing like a symphony of pure joy. Sophia wore a light blue dress that Edward had picked out especially for her, the first piece of clothing he had ever bought for his daughter. Her heart treatment was progressing magnificently, and the physical transformation was remarkable, but it was the emotional change that was most stunning. The girl who had arrived wary and frightened now radiated confidence and happiness. "Dad, look how well Sophia can swim now," Gabriel shouted from the lake, proud of the sister who floated gracefully in the very waters that had nearly cost her her life weeks ago. "She's braver than me." Edward smiled, remembering how this same lake had been the stage for a near tragedy. Now, it had become a symbol of his family's rebirth. Sophia had conquered her fear of the water, just as he had conquered his fear of showing emotion. "Be careful not to get too tired," Edward called out, but his voice held affection rather than the over-anxious tone he'd had before. He had learned to balance protection with freedom, understanding that his children needed space to grow. A lone figure approached on the park trail. Marianne walked slowly, carrying a small purse, her hesitation showing she wasn't sure if she'd be welcome. For the past few weeks, she had started intensive therapy and had been genuinely trying to understand her past actions. Can I join you?" she asked timidly, addressing Edward first, then looking nervously toward the children in the lake. Edward gave a silent nod. The rebuilding process would be long and difficult, but Marianne had shown real progress. More importantly, Sophia had expressed a willingness to get to know her biological mother, as long as it was on her own terms. "Mom!" Gabriel ran out of the water, still dripping, and hugged Marianne without hesitation. His capacity for forgiveness continued to astound Edward. "Sophia, come say hi to Mom properly." Sophia emerged from the water more slowly, assessing the situation with the natural caution of someone who had learned to protect herself from a very young age. Marianne knelt on the sand, bringing herself down to her daughter's level. "Sophia," Marianne said, her voice trembling slightly, "I know I made terrible mistakes. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I would very much like to try to be the mother you always deserved." Sophia studied Marianne's face for a long moment. "You're not going to try and send me away again?" she asked with the direct honesty of childhood. "Never again," Marianne replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You are my daughter, and I spent 8 years trying to forget that. But now I know that you are the most important part of who I should have been." Sophia stepped forward hesitantly, and to everyone's surprise, gave Marianne a brief hug. "Okay, we can try," she said simply, displaying a generosity of spirit that humbled every adult present. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, the family gathered on the blanket spread across the grass. It was different from the picnic planned 3 weeks ago. Now there were 4 of them, trying to figure out how to be a real, honest, and complete family. Edward watched his children share a sandwich, Gabriel automatically giving the best pieces to Sophia, who returned his gesture with smiles that lit up her entire face. Marianne watched it all with a mixture of awe and regret, finally understanding what she had lost all those years. "Dad," Sophia said, resting her head on his shoulder, "thank you for not giving up on me." "Thank you for teaching me what it truly means to be a father," Edward replied, kissing the top of her head. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, reflecting on the calm waters of the lake, Edward knew that some scars would take time to fully heal. But here, surrounded by his children and watching Marianne genuinely strive to rebuild the bonds she had broken, he understood a fundamental truth. True wealth wasn't in his investments or properties, but in the courage to love unconditionally and the willingness to fight for those who truly mattered. The lake, which had witnessed a near tragedy, now reflected a family reborn, imperfect, wounded, but finally true and complete.